we can at least get started with the welcomes. First of all, my name's Elizabeth. I'm the current chair of the Anglo-Ethiopian Society, and I just want to welcome you all here to this very beautiful house. I mean, these walls must have heard some poetry over the years, but I think this is probably the first time they'll have heard Ethiopian poetry. So it's a very nice occasion. It's good to see so many people here. There's some familiar faces, some of our own members, but also some unfamiliar faces. If you're not a member of the Society, if you enjoy this evening, perhaps you may feel you would like to join. We have membership forms at the back, and you will have a chance to talk to us at the end, because we're going to have a glass of wine and there will also be an opportunity to buy some books. This is the second poetry evening we've had for the Society. It's a fairly new innovation brought in by Chris Beckett. Chris organised a previous one, which was a tremendous success, was a bit more homegrown, a bit more homespun than this. This is the first time we've actually invited a particularly distinguished Ethiopian poet. So we're delighted to have Hama Tuma with us. As you see, he has a great body of work. Some will be for sale at the end, some of his books, including this one, absolutely hot off the press. Chris, you just picked them up this afternoon and brought them in. Yeah. Anyway, let me hand over to Chris now.
As you know, we're here this evening to, the way I think about it, this is a celebration of one of my certainly favourite Ethiopian authors, the absolutely wonderful poet and short story writer. He's also an essayist and a human rights campaigner living in exile in Paris. He was born in Addis Ababa and he studied law at Addis Ababa University. And while still a student, he joined the Campaign for Democracy and was eventually forced to leave Ethiopia back in the early 1970s. So he's been a refugee for a very long time, and we're going to hear more about that in a while. This provoked Hama into writing poems and satirical short stories, which is what we're here to celebrate today. Hama, the great poet, and I really mean that, the great poet and satirical writer. Not Hama specifically tonight, anyway, not Hama the politician or the campaigner, but Hama, the, for me, Keatsian rebel angel, for whom truth and beauty are inseparable, for whom truthful and beautiful words are the key to our humanity. Hama has published 3 collections of poetry in Amharic and 1 in English, as well as 2 highly acclaimed books of short stories and 4 books of essays, including what you see here. His work is both, he writes in both English and Amharic, and this is very unusual for an Ethiopian writer, I think. And a lot of his work have been translated into many different languages, including French, Italian, and Hebrew. So he's a truly global writer, Hama. And tonight we're actually launching, as Elizabeth said, a new collection, a selection of his poems, some of them with the Amharic into English, but most of them actually poems that Hama wrote in English, and he's a truly accomplished poet of the English language. So the book that we've just published is called Just a Nobody, after a poem that was published in Modern Poetry and Translation last year, and was an incredible hit. This poem, we thought we'd start the evening with this poem, Just a Nobody, because it's quite an iconic poem. And McConnon, when he gets off his camera, is actually going to read it for us. I'm then going to read you just a short extract from one of Hama's short stories. And then Alimu, an old friend of Hama, is going to ask Hama to tell us something about his life and his writing and his approach to writing. Finally, after all that, we hope that we'll have an opportunity for you to ask Hama any questions you might have. And please don't hold back. Any questions you want to ask, no taboo subjects. and then afterwards we'll relax for a drink, and then you can buy some books, as I think Elizabeth said, and Hama would be very pleased to sign them for us. So, McConnon, if you'd like to read us Just a Nobody.
Just a nobody. The dead man was no one, just a man in tattered clothes, no shoes, just a coin in his pocket, no ID cards, no bus tickets. He was a nobody, dirty and skinny, a no one, a nobody, who clenched his hand before he died. But when they pried his fingers open, this nobody, they found a whole country. Thank you.
So that's an example of one of Hama's terribly hard-hitting poems. And this, if I can actually read it, is the first few paragraphs of one of his short stories. It's called The Case of the Traitorous Alphabet. Someone has said that during the times of revolution, the first victims are words. Ideals make revolutions, but revolutions kill them, said someone else, no doubt deceived by the reality of things. But I prefer the Ethiopian wise man who said that the revolution murders the alphabet. A profound observation, even if some nasty wag is said to have replied cynically, "Well, what did you expect? We're poor, we can't even afford words." But to come back to my story, the revolution is a multi-form battle, and the battle over words is as deadly as any other. This at least is confirmed by the Ethiopian experience. Take the bloody struggle between the government and those who it calls anarchists. And by the way, when it says government in here, it's talking about the Derg, I think. Take the bloody struggle between the government and those whom it calls anarchists. They fought over words, and the difference had a life and death importance. The anarchists referred to workers as labader, those who live by their sweat. The government preferred to call them wozader, those who live by their sweat. You may ask, so what the hell's the problem? But be patient and I'll explain. The problem lies in the type of sweat. The anarchists say lab is the sweat of workers, while was is the sweat of rich people. The former is sweat oozing out of your body if you have to labour in some dismal factory, behind oxen in a field, or as a coolie, etc. While the latter is the sweat of the rich, and for people and fat people acquired from too much cholesterol and lack of exercise. The difference between types of sweat defined the political colouring, so as it was said. The government said sweat is sweat, and anyway it could not be expected to use the anarchist word for workers, even if they did happen to be the first to translate politically the word worker into the local language. No self-respecting government could be without its own words and mottos, could it? In short, if you said labader instead of wozader, it was ample proof, that you were an anarchist, and you would get killed for it. So now we're going to hand over to Alimu to ask Hama some questions.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to ask Hama a few questions, actually, to start our discussion. Let me start with your name, Hama. The name as a writer, Hama is not usually common used name in Ethiopia. How did you choose it, and what does it mean?
Thank you for inviting me, first of all. The name Hama came from a minority ethnic group in some part of Ethiopia, which many people do not know. In that part of Ethiopia, when you greet people, say good morning, they say Hama Tuma. They say this means everything is fine. But unfortunately for me, in Oromia, which is another language in our country, Hama Tuma means hit him very hard. So people said, why did you pick this name? So I tell them I picked it from another group of Ethiopians and not from the Oromos. So that's how it was to say everything is fine. And it was a pseudonym. But when the book was published, my companion who's here, she sent my photo with it. So the pseudonym was of no use, but I kept it anyway.
All right. Can you tell us a bit about your early life, about your education, about your your activism in the student movement, and the story how you left your country and what brought you to Europe?
Well, I was born in Addis Ababa a long time ago, time of the emperor. It's a long time. I grew up in Addis Ababa. I did my elementary school in Addis Ababa in a school called Patriot School, or Benyosh. Then I did my secondary in the Tafari Makon School, which was run by Jesuits from Canada, Quebec, I think. And then Haile Selassie University. I joined the law faculty not because I really wanted to study law, but I didn't like mathematics, and there was no mathematics in the law faculty, one. And two, the classes were very short, 3 hours in the morning and the afternoon was free. So I calculated this and I joined the law faculty. I stayed there, I think I stayed there 4 years or more, and then I was expelled because of student activity, and then I had to leave the country. Left for the Sudan, then went to Algeria, and eventually made my way also to Europe, and then went back to the country, and another, not through Addis Ababa, but through another means. And I used to come to Europe because in Europe we have the student meetings, that these are the heydays of the revolution in the world, the 60s. 70s, early 70s, so we used to come to Europe. That's why I made it to Europe. As a member of, as a young student, most of us at that time we were against the emperor's rule. We opposed it, we made demonstrations, and we were imprisoned for short periods, not as now, or as before Mengistu's time. But then it became a little bit difficult to stay there and also to publicize about the struggle of the Ethiopian people and the students. We chose a way of getting out of Ethiopia, which was not legal, and we came to Europe. Eventually I came to Europe.
What made you start to write, and how do you take a painful and frightening situation in reality, such as trial without real justice, and turn into a hilarious satire? And is that why your Cameroon and journalist friend complained that your satire is so cruel?
Well, I never imagined myself as a writer. In the Ethiopian student movement, when there were many accomplished poets of that time, we were more inclined to listening and to copying there, because most of the poems were forbidden. We used to copy by hand and distribute the copies of Gomorrah, example. And otherwise I wrote nothing. Writing did not interest me. We read books because our teachers made us read books, a lot of books. We had English courses, Shakespeare. We had to do this for our secondary graduation. And in the school where I was, there was a reading culture. We had a library, and we had a librarian who brought us books. They made us really read books, many English books, classics. Otherwise, writing, I was not that much interested in writing. But I used to like to make fun of big serious meetings. So every time after a big student meeting, I would write in an exercise book a parody of that meeting. Though the thing was very serious, and I was also part of it. And eventually, after, I think in the 80s, I think in the 80s, there was a BBC short story competition. So I wrote a short story and sent it. I was in the Sudan at the time. And I won £75. It was a lot of money at that time. So I said so I can write, and I had a lot of stories in me, some of them from my own experience, some of them which I've been told. So I said I can write, so I wrote Socialist Witch Doctor in a very short time and sent it, and that was published. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan, was a good friend, he helped us, and the book was published. So after that I started to write. And by inclination I like to make fun of a lot of serious things, so I was inclined towards satire, and that's how it came. I don't know about the praises Chris gave me, but so I went into literature in this manner.
You write in Amharic and English as well. Why you do this? And can you tell us if there is any difference in your process in each language? Can you tell us something about your writing process?
Well, when we were in school, it's not like now. When we were in school in our time, after the third grade, we studied everything in English, not in Amharic. Everything was in English, so we spoke more English than we studied Amharic for the grammar only, as a language. But everything, geography, history, everything we learned in English. So we were inclined more towards English, that generation. The next generation, they come after, which came after us, wrote in Amharic, because they learned also in Amharic, their own language or other languages. I write in English. It is not very difficult to write in English for me. I write in Amharic also. I write in Amharic. Actually, I write better poems in Amharic than in English, actually. And I've written a lot in Amharic. I write Amharic stories also. But then again, the problem is that the publishing process, when you write in your own language, is very restricted. I cannot have my books published in Addis. There is a translation of the Socialist Doctor in Addis, which has surprised me. Maybe it is because it refers to an olden time. But if I write a new book, and which is a little bit, making fun of satirical against the existing regime or the reality, I don't think it will even get published. So the fact that you cannot publish in your own language restricts your urge to write in your own language. But in English it is easier, you can have it published. So both process, writing in English or writing in Amharic, for me is not very difficult. And I haven't felt the dichotomy of these things as most African writers insist that unless you write in your own language, you are still the victim of colonial or imperial domination. With that, I'm not very much involved in that. I can understand it, but one should have a translation of one's work in every language so that people can read it and experience from it. Anyway, when I started writing the short story for the BBC, then I said if I write more, I can reach more audience and also show the reality of the Ethiopian situation at that time, for the foreigners especially. Even when we wrote about the Red Terror experience in our country, we wrote it in English the first time. so that we inform the world what really passed in our country. So for the process, it has not been very difficult for me to write in English or in French. And the other thing, I have not analyzed my writing and myself on this level, so I find it difficult to answer. I just do it, so.
I don't know whether you realize that, but from my observation, most of your stories, short stories, are dealing with crime. Their themes are crime. They are dealing with crime. Is that because of your low background, or is there any other reason?
Because I come from a society that is full of crimes. Official and unofficial.
Yeah, coming to your poems are simple but passionate and even angry. Do you think that's part of the poet's job, is to tell absolute truth and challenge the society, the government, and even the society? Can I say that you are the torch bearers of the great Ethiopian writers, of protest poem writers during the time of Haile Selassie? Can I say that?
No.
Yeah, but most of the time, most of your poems are challenging and angry.
Well, there could be angry poems. I write more angry poems in Amharic than in English. Maybe some bitterness of some pessimism and some optimism, combined, because that's Ethiopia. You can't be optimist all the time, or you don't have to be a pessimist all the time because the situation demands it. Otherwise, you'll achieve nothing. There must be some hope and some optimism in the process. Some say my poems are angry. I don't know. Some anger there is, some bitterness. The fact that ordinary people, most of us in our millions, we are not treated well. We are always subjected to some kind of process, oppression or domination or misery or whatever. That's the reality of Africa anyway. It's not only that of Ethiopia. So I try to write about these things, and some of them become a little bit dark or bizarre because of that, like the poem you read. I don't know what it means actually. Come to it.
Alongside your anger, I have read some of your works which envisage bright future for Ethiopia, like When We Return. What makes you, as you say, the reality back at home is not bright, really, but what makes you hopeful about your homeland, Ethiopia?
Well, one has to be an optimist. I think that's a must, optimism of the heart, as what Gramsci used to say, pessimism of the mind. But, optimism of the heart is essential, otherwise, I'm optimist for all of Africa actually, but it's a very rough place. I've been to many African countries, seen a lot, and it's not something that that gives you optimism. If you take South Sudan, take Somalia, and all the that neighborhood, and all the other places, it doesn't give you much optimism. But then you have to have optimism to go forward, to fight, to hope for a better future for your children, for your country. So that's the optimism. It may be wishful thinking, but it is there.
Thank you, Hama. I don't have any more questions. I think I don't have many more questions because I want to give you a chance to ask him. So I'm handing over. Please.
I think maybe, McConnell, can you read us that poem that Alimu has just talked about?
Okay.
When we return, and then that will give a chance for people to think of their own questions that they might like to ask.
When we return. When we return one day, tomorrow, when the exile ends and the loneliness and despair vanish forever. When we return, let us hear the music of love and hope renewed, not hate. When we return, let us not visit the mass graves and cemeteries, but the museums, the nurseries of happy kids. If and when we return, let it be so. The future we had dreamt of, died and sacrificed for, not to the past so much abhorred, nor the present loved by no one. When we return, let it be to the tomorrow we died for. When we return.